Hello and welcome on this autumnal day in England. It's a little nippy, where we are going to hear an incredible story from an incredible guest. It's one of those stories where life comes at you from all angles and you have to dust off and keep punching on. It's a story about a young woman with an ambition to become a foreign correspondent, a job in a man's world, and succeeded for years covering the most strange and colorful stories in China and Asia as a correspondent and bureau chief for Reuters and The Australian. Then came war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and she went to those places as bureau chief for the French news agency, Agence France Presse, and the American one, the Associated Press. It was dangerous, it was dirty, it is heart-wrenching. Why did she do it? She could have got married with a family in her native Australia and lived like in a Hollywood film. The job of a war correspondent is fulfilling, but does it actually change anything? We will find out. And from those experiences, our guest wrote a highly praised book, High Tea in Mosul, the true story of two English women in war-torn Iraq, of which the Age newspaper in Melbourne praised as being a tale of human cost in a misguided war. The Spectator compared her writing to that of Joseph Conrad, because it made us see what was actually happening. Our guest is now a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine and regularly appears on radio and television worldwide. She was one of the last out of Kabul when the Taliban took over last year. And a couple of months ago, she returned to report only to find herself detained, questioned, threatened, and finally escaping by a hair's breadth. She'll tell us how. And on getting back to London, she was rushed into emergency surgery with a life-threatening illness from which she is now recovering. In all of that, we will find out her purpose, her passion, and her grit. So without more introduction, welcome Lynne O'Donnell to tell us all.
Thanks, Humphrey. Hi. Gosh, is that me?
That was you, yes. It's like looking in the mirror, isn't it? Talking about mirrors. Before we start, I'm completely attracted to that skin or whatever it is behind you. What is that? On your wall there, is it a tiger?
It's a tiger, but it's a carpet. It's one of a pair, and it's a pillar in a temple, in a Tibetan temple. It's a carpet that goes around the pillar in a Buddhist temple, and I have two of them. I have, like I said, a pair, and they're just my favorite things. I think it's spectacular. Yeah,
it is. Well, where did you get it from?
It's in China. When I was living in China, I collected unusual carpets, and I bought these two from a Tibetan trader. Yeah.
It's absolutely fantastic. Now, let's go back to the beginning. You grew up in Melbourne, Australia, and I can tell that from your accent. And I'll ask you later on why the hell you're in London. But when did you first think you wanted to be a journalist?
I was doing my final year of high school, of secondary school, and I had done my exams, and I ran into somebody in the street, a neighbour who had done her exams a year before me, and she had joined one of the big newspapers in Melbourne called the Herald. We had three. We had the Age, and we had the Herald, which was the afternoon paper, and we had the Sun News Pictorial. And I hadn't really thought about it until then, and it sounded like it might be interesting and intriguing and fun. And so I applied to the Sun, and I was accepted. Hundreds of kids applied every year. I think out of 600 applicants, they took a dozen, and I was one who was taken on to do an old-fashioned cadetship. So I joined the Sun as a cadet, like Jimmy Olsen did, and I worked at the Sun for 4 or 5 years. I went through my cadetship, learned how every section of the newspaper worked, and spent time on the desks and bending pictures because we were hot print, hot type at the time. And they sent me to do an undergraduate degree, and I learned how to do shorthand. So that's how it started.
Goodness. Now, I have to do this. It's very personal to me because I used to work for the Melbourne Herald.
Oh, my goodness. I had no idea. You know exactly where I'm talking about.
You didn't work in that old building in Flinders Street, did you?
Absolutely, I did. That's where and you know what it is now? It's a block of flats with a Greek restaurant on the ground floor. And they
I'm sure it is, all newspaper, the whole of Fleet Street.
Yes, yeah, and so they still have the brass things that they used to put the front pages on and the posters in, and now they're like it's like a museum on the outside of it. So every now and then when I'm in Melbourne, I go up and have a look at it. Yeah, but that's where I started, with the presses in the basement, and yeah,
Yes,
wow.
and when you walked in, there was the bust of Keith Murdoch, who's
Yes,
Rupert
right.
Murdoch's father.
Yeah.
It was in the foyer.
Yeah. That's right. Oh, I had no idea. How wonderful.
Oh my God, the world gets smaller and smaller. I'm not going to ask because I remember there that I thought it was the best journalist job in the world, something called Police Rounds.
Oh, yes,
and
I did that.
You start at 5 a.m, and if anything was happening anywhere in Victoria, you could hire a plane or a car or a helicopter to go and cover it. Unlimited.
Absolutely. It was wonderful. Those 3 years of my cadetship were probably the most intensely wonderful years of my life. It was fantastic. Fancy that.
But you wanted to be a foreign correspondent always, or what happened there?
Well, no, I didn't start off with the ambition of being a foreign correspondent, but I found myself drawn to China. My mother and father took me on a vacation with them to Beijing in the middle of winter one year. And that was I think it must have been early 1989. And I developed a fascination for China. And then Tiananmen came along in the middle of that year. And then later
that was the repression of the democracy demonstrations there, wasn't it? When they went and crushed everything. Yes.
Yeah. And then a couple of months after that, I ran into I think I went on vacation again to Hong Kong, and I met somebody who had worked at the China Daily newspaper in Beijing. And I said, how did that work? And she told me the English language newspaper that was run by the Chinese Communist Party is still a sister paper to the People's Daily, and they hired a handful of foreigners, journalists, every year to go and put their news to make it look like foreign news. And so I wrote to them after Tiananmen. They were having a very difficult time finding people who wanted to go and work in China. So I wrote to them while I was in Hong Kong, and they sent me a plane ticket and a visa. So I went.
Oh, you went, and that was it. So tell me, what was your first foreign story that you reported on as a foreign correspondent, and how did you feel, when you'd done it? Did you feel that it was a rites of passage sort of thing?
Oh, probably. I probably felt pleased with myself, I spent a couple of months in Hong Kong before I moved up to Beijing, writing for some newspapers and magazines in Australia. And when I was able to get the clips, I felt wonderful. Wow, this is really me telling the story of what is happening out in the world. And Hong Kong was moving towards the handover, 1997. This was well before that, but still it was in the air. And so there was a real atmosphere about foreign news and telling a story, and not so far away from Australia. So yeah, I felt quite thrilled by it. I didn't do very much foreign reporting while I was working at the China Daily, but I came back to Hong Kong from a one-year contract with the China Daily to work for Reuters, and that's when I really feel that I became a foreign correspondent. Yeah.
Reuters is this big, is a big sort of benchmark, isn't it, of foreign reporting. Now for our audience, we are going to hear some fantastic stories coming up. If you've got any questions at all about foreign reporting, foreign affairs, of Lynne's life, which you're going to hear more about, just put it in the chat and we will feed it into the conversation as always. And being Goldster, Lynne will answer any questions if she can. If she can't, she'll say she can't, but she will. I want to, before we get to the sort of gritty Iraq-Afghanistan war reporting thing, you had a huge beat in Asia, and Asia is becoming more and more important to us, particularly now there's the National People's Congress of the of China going on. The hardline leader, Xi Jinping, as we're beginning to know him here, is got a yet another term. China is becoming our enemy, as it were. How do you see that being reported? How is, when you hear the political rhetoric here and from what you know about it, give us a perspective.
Well, I had a couple of different incarnations in China, a few actually. And so I saw it from a lot of different angles. When I was at the China Daily, I was basically working for a Politburo tear sheet. I saw very clearly how the upper echelons of the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda machine worked. And it was insidious and it was frightening and it was all consuming. And because it was in the months after the Tiananmen crackdown, it was also very paranoid. My time at China Daily coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I saw how the government reacted to that and how they clamped down on information, freedom of speech. And I saw it as very insidious and very powerful and really rooted in fear. I went back to Hong Kong after that, as I said, and I joined Reuters. I stayed there for a couple of years, working on the editing desk, so basically covering and editing news from all over the world. And then I went back to China to study Chinese, and Reuters asked me if I would start reporting on the commodities markets because China was coming back to the international markets to buy everything from copper to soybeans and cotton and sugar and everything in between. So I started a specialization as a commodities correspondent for Reuters, which I did while I was studying Chinese. And then I went back to Hong Kong to work for Reuters doing that full time. It was a fantastic job because I could look at a map. I had freedom to move all over China. I could look at a map and say, where do I want to go? I haven't been over there yet. What do they do? And so I would go and walk around coffee plantations on the China-Burma border for a week and write stories that were run on the features pages of newspapers and magazines all over the world because somebody, walking around coffee plantations in China, who knew, or I'd go to the former paramilitary farms growing cotton or tomatoes or wherever. I went all over and I saw how China was coming to the market, how it was learning its way through the economic forests and trees of the global markets and the mistakes it made, and how it also developed large corporations and pretended that they weren't state-run, but how state control over everything was getting tighter and tighter. After that, I moved back to Hong Kong when they were coming onto the A shares and the B shares and setting up stock markets, and saw then too how they were mired in corruption and official manipulation and answerable only to the Chinese Communist Party. And when I joined the Australian as a newspaper correspondent, I used that knowledge and that information also to try and convey to readers of Australia's national paper just what China is and was becoming, and the influence that it was having on Australia, which is basically a big supermarket for commodities, whether it's coal and copper or gas or sugar and wheat. And I felt like I was banging my head against a wall because I'd go home for holidays in Australia and people would say, well, I'd much rather that we were in China's purview than America's. And I'm like, I don't know about that, man. Read what I write. But I feel like over the past 15 years or 20 years that there's been a growing realization of the insidious influence that the Chinese Communist Party has, rewriting history, integrating agents onto university campuses, trying to embed surveillance technology into our own telecommunications and transport.
Can I just, I mean, when you were talking about that, that struck me. So you had the your original sort of baptism of fire was actually as a, party apparatchik, really, working for the China Daily, and then you you learnt Chinese, so then you traveled around actually reporting on China's coming out into the world, the growing of its wealth that we all talk about. So when we get to a few years back, when Britain announced its golden era with China was going to invest in our high-speed railways and our airports and whatever. And the issue over the Huawei stuff here, what was going through your mind, or what did you write about then?
Well, I wasn't writing much about China at all at that while that was happening. I'd moved on.
Yes.
But certainly my thoughts were, this isn't good. We really should not be beholden to we shouldn't be allowing it, basically. I don't trust the motivation of the Chinese Communist Party. Ordinary Chinese people don't trust the motivations of the Chinese Communist Party. And I was really worried about it and concerned, and talked about it a lot with people that I know, and other journalists, and
And you talked about banging your head against the brick wall, but presumably the diplomats and the intelligence services and all those people knew what you knew, yet the politicians in Australia and here were saying, no, we have to be friendly with these people. What was going on there, do you think?
Well, I also saw the development of diplomacy towards basically a platform for enabling business. So you no longer had embassies as observation posts, if you like. You had embassies as facilitators for business. And China had very strict rules and regulations on foreign businesses. They couldn't be wholly owned. They had to work with partners that took more than 50% share of whatever the local business would have been. If they were in banking or insurance, they could only be observers and pass on their knowledge and their, in many cases, proprietary information, software, whatever. A lot of the foreign businesses that were had a presence in China during my time there and in Hong Kong complained about how their proprietary stuff, if you like, was stolen. Supply chains were diverted to secondary factories that were run by, the Communist Party member who was the brother-in-law of the guy who was the manager of their factory. I mean, these weren't unusual stories, People were kidnapped, people were killed, foreign Chinese people who were foreign passport holders were threatened and jailed and held as hostages. All sorts of awful things went on. And so I saw this as the modus operandi of creeping Chinese influence.
And now, if anybody's got any questions about China, now is the time to ask it, because we're going to be heading west to the Middle East shortly afterwards. But Lynne is an expert on this, so any queries at all, however straightforward or stupid you think they might be, just put them in there, because I want to ask you about two particular exotic places in that part of the world that Tibet. Tell us about Tibet. What's it?
Well, I was never allowed to go to Tibet proper. The Chinese wouldn't let me go. But I went to places in China that had previously been part of Tibet before the Chinese Communist Party took them over and split it up into. So I went to places like Ningxia and Qinghai and elsewhere, Shangri-La as they called it.
Tell us, Shangri-La is a place that actually exists, isn't it? It's in the mountains, and yes. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I think by the time I got there, it had been the conversion of it into a twee little Potemkin tourist town had already well and truly begun. And you've traveled a lot in China, so you know how the heart of somewhere can be ripped out and tiled over, and suddenly, it's kind of I don't know, a doll's house version of what it used to be. And I saw that happening there.
Yes.
In the places that I went to in Ningxia and Qinghai, these were amongst, and in Sichuan, these were amongst the poorest places that I have ever been. Tibetans were really marginalized and terrorized. They weren't allowed to go to school using their own language and stuff like that. And I did make a trip to Dharamsala. You know, a lot of Tibetans were able to climb across the mountains into Nepal, where they were given asylum, and then go from there to India, where they settled around where the Dalai Lama lives in Dharamsala, McLeod Ganj. And I went there and met a lot of the Tibetan diaspora, which was a really good magazine story when I was working at the Australian. But I think that what's been happening to the Muslim Uyghur people that we have known about over the last few years was happening to Tibetans long before. That was one of the biggest stories in the world, one of the biggest human rights causes alongside the Palestinians when I was a correspondent in China, and I wrote about it a lot.
And Mongolia, which is that vast sort of bridge, although it's far too big to be a bridge, between the old Soviet Union and China. I mean, incredible place.
Truly incredible place. I went there a few times as well. It was on my beat. And one of the most amazing stories I found there was about a young Australian woman who had joined a Hindu cult called the Ananda Marga. And she went there, she was in Taiwan and with the Ananda Marga, and one day they said to her, okay, you've got to go to Mongolia, which, as we know, is a Tibetan Buddhist culture. And so she set up there and started teaching yoga. And one day she opened her front door and there was a box outside her front door with a baby in it. And she looked around and there was no one there, and she took the baby in. And within a year, she had 100 orphaned Mongolian children that she was looking after. And the Australian embassy and community in Beijing was a huge support for her, and they helped build her an orphanage and a school, and it was just the most astounding story. And most of these, like 90% of the children that she took in, were girls, because for some reason the Mongolians were giving away their girls and keeping the boys, kind of in the way that, you know, the population gender skew happened in China. But it was, you know, it was just so amazing. You'd go into this place and 100 little Mongolian kiddies would just swarm over, you know, wanting to be picked up and hugged. It was the most amazing thing. And years later, after I'd left China and left the Australian newspaper, I was invited to her home. She had had a very sad and violent upbringing, and had left and joined this Hindu cult, which in Australia was only really known because they'd tried to blow up a Choggam meeting. It was really weird, this sort of dichotomy between the Ananda Marga through this lovely nun that I met, and them being a violent terrorist attack in Melbourne during a Choggam meeting. And she had been reconciled through this amazing story that I wrote about her with her family. So it was a real happy ending. I love Mongolia. It's great.
That is. I mean, I found that when I was in Mongolia, there was a story whereby, as you said, it was a Buddhist nation, but which had been repressed by the Soviet Union, and the monks in the temples were just reviving, and they found themselves competing against the Mormons and the evangelical Americans that were coming in to do it. And they would be getting a free Bible and a free toothbrush and everything, so they were all technically converting to Christianity. And the Buddhist monks were furious. They said, how can we compete against this? Nobody's giving us any money to do anything.
Well, true. I ran into Christian evangelicals when I was there, and it was like, yes, I've accepted Jesus into my heart, and my kids, I can now afford to send my kids to school. So there was that. But also, you know, there were only 2 million Mongolians on this, what did we used to call it, 4 times the size of France. And people
Yes.
used to say, if we hadn't sent all of our boys to be monastic, we'd have 30 million people and we'd be a strong country and we wouldn't be predated by the Russians on one side of us and the Chinese on the other.
Chinese on the other, yeah. And it's
Yeah.
a beautiful sort of expanse of emptiness, isn't
Yeah.
it? It's one of those places in the world that you get to and you can see big sky and the Mongolian steppe goes on forever.
Yeah.
And everybody rides their horses and their jeeps around.
Yes, exactly. And they've got the original horses, the Preslowski horses.
Yes.
And there was one story I remember telling. They had a place called Cafe des Arts or something like that, and I went there, and there was trout on the menu, and I said, "Oh goodness, trout! Oh, where does the trout come from?" They said, "From from the river out there or the lake out there." I said, "I'll have that." This guy turned up with these 2 trout that were the biggest trout I've ever seen, because they were about 25 years old, because Mongolians don't eat fish. So the trout were just sort of like free to grow to this, this enormous size. It was amazing. Everything about Mongolia was amazing.
That's incredible. So now we're going to move, because then came the wars and you went to become a war correspondent. Now, before that, you were not a war correspondent. You were a commodities correspondent for Reuters, going around
China
coffee
correspondent. Yeah.
Yes, and all that. And then you moved west because there was Afghanistan, 9/11, Afghanistan, and then Iraq. Tell us that trajectory.
Well, I was still the China correspondent for the Australian, and on about the 9th, I think, of September 2001, I was in Urumqi, which is the capital of Xinjiang region, province in the far west of China. And I was going to Kashgar, the old Silk Road trading post. And I got on a train, and there was nothing high speed about it. It was trundle, 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 2 days, and overnight. And I was in a carriage with a couple of bunks. And at 9 o'clock the following morning, my phone rang on the dot of 9, and it was the lady who worked for me in my office, Xiaoli, in Beijing. And I said, yes. She said, "Oh, just calling to say hi." I said, "No, you don't do that. I know you. You've never called anyone just to say hi. What's going on?" She said, "I thought you might like to know what's happening in America." I'm like, "Yeah." She said, 30,000 people are dead in New York and the president is missing. And then the line dropped out. And I've gone, and I couldn't, I was in the middle of nowhere, black gravel desert undulating outside the train window. And I had no way of getting in contact with her again. And in the Chinese language, it's very easy to get your multiples mixed up: 3, 30, 300, 3,000, 30,000. So she had said, instead of saying 3,000, she said 30,000. So I'm thinking, what on earth is going on? And I sat at the little table between the bunks in my carriage, waiting for a signal to come back on it, just staring at my phone. And 2 hours later it rang, and it was a friend of mine in Beijing, an American friend. And he said, "For some reason, I turned on the television last night, which I never do, before I went to bed, just in time to see the second plane go into the second tower in New York." And so he filled me in with what was going on. And I was still about 18 hours away from Kashgar. There was nothing I could do. And so all I could do is watch little men on little donkeys, in the distance. Who knows where they were going? Who knows where they were coming from? Until I arrived in Kashgar. And Kashgar, as you know, is a Muslim town. Very close to the Pakistan border. You can drive into Pakistan within just a couple of hours. And part of it also borders the Wakhan corridor, which shares about 70 miles of border with Afghanistan, China-Afghanistan, through the Wakhan border. So quite a strategic place for what the world had just been through. And I had kind of missed the hysteria. it wasn't until I went home for Christmas that year that I saw the footage of the planes going into the towers, because by then the Chinese government had removed it from all broadcasts. And so all I could do was write a story about what it was like being, on the border of China and Afghanistan in a Muslim part of the world, while Pakistan was going up in flames just over the way. And the Americans were preparing for war. So that was my 9/11. And then
what were the people in Kashgar saying, or the people on the train? Were they getting this information from their own sources, or was not the Chinese internet or cell phone system that sophisticated then?
When I got to Kashgar, I went straight to a cafe and sat in this lovely old wood-lined cafe that was filled with Muslim men sitting around having tea, and there was real fear, because they knew that this had been an atrocity perpetrated by Muslim terrorists, Islamists, and that this could only mean that things for them, under the yoke of the Chinese Communist Party, now the Chinese communists would have reason to paint them as potential terrorists, and things could only get worse. Yeah, they knew what was coming.
So did you? I was put it in a cliched way. Did you go and chase war to cover it, or did that story sort of envelop what you were doing anyway and became a natural progression of your work?
Oh God, no. I'd been, the biggest thing since sliced bread, because the whole world wanted to know every minute of every day about China. And suddenly nobody wanted to know about China. So if you're used to being on the front page and suddenly your story is nowhere near the front page, what do? You go where the front page story is. So I talked my editors into letting me go to Uzbekistan. So I got on a plane and I flew Beijing, Tashkent, and then I got a car and I drove down to the border with Afghanistan, to this horrible little town called Termez. Not so horrible, just one of these, like sub-Soviet towns that are all over the former Soviet Union countries. And near a place called the Friendship Bridge, near a bridge that the Soviets had left Afghanistan coming over back into Uzbekistan. The whole border was fenced. Uzbekistan was very keen on making sure that the Taliban didn't infiltrate its territory. And I spent the next few months going Beijing, Tashkent, Termez, back to Tashkent. I went to Shanghai for, I don't know, an APEC or one of those meetings where everybody said we're all in it together. And then back again until finally, a few days before the Americans invaded, I was there at the right time when the Uzbeks provided a barge to go down the Amu Darya, which forms the border between the Amu River, forms the border between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. And I went into Mazar-e Sharif, which is a big northern city, in time to see the American invasion. So I got there, I think, on the 5th or the 6th of October, and the Americans invaded on the 7th. So once again, right place, right time, front page. Phew.
Front page again. And so you did that, and then you were in Iraq, the American invasion there. I just want to encapsulate some of your thoughts, because you did the China thing, the whole of the developing world there. You saw the West's reaction to 9/11 in Afghanistan and America's reaction in Iraq. The people in Kashgar who were frightened, they knew immediately what would happen. What about you? Encapsulate the past 20 years, because I want to get your trip back to Afghanistan in a minute. Did you go through periods of anger, hopelessness, elation when you were, because it gradually got worse and worse, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. That's a really interesting question. You're asking me about basically the arc of awareness that I might have experienced. You know, the theme of my life since September 2001 has been killing, misery, death, retribution, kiddies losing legs, fear, being threatened myself. It's just been awful, 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 awful. And I don't see any end in sight. Human misery, I guess, has dominated my career. The worst things that human beings can do to each other for no other reason than power, money, ego. It's men who perpetrate war and who are the reason for the abject misery and poverty that we see, and which in the West we are fortunate enough to be able to ignore. Yeah.
And did you, I mean, because there was Afghanistan and there was Iraq, how did your awareness, percolate, as it were? Did you start blaming people? Did you start thinking there were solutions? Do you now think there is no solution?
Well, when I went to cover the war in Iraq, again, another US-led invasion, I met a couple of ladies who became the protagonists of my book. And one of them kept a diary that she gave to me and that I included in my book. And when I read her, of course, her diary was contemporaneous, and she was very much against the Saddam regime, and yet she was also very much against the war to remove Saddam's regime, because children were killed by bombs, innocent people were killed by munitions. The fallout is what we don't hear enough about, I think. Yeah. So did I start blaming people? No, all parties play a role. But it's ordinary people who suffer.
What was your first experience in war reporting that made you think, I don't know, this is different? This is not commodity reporting in China, or even, Buddhist repression in Tibet. This is something very different that changed you?
When I went to Afghanistan and was there for the US invasion, I got into Mazar-i-Sharif just as a huge story erupted there. The Northern Alliance in Afghanistan had brought trucks loaded with Taliban prisoners from a neighboring province into Balkh. I was in Balkh province. Mazar-i-Sharif is the capital of Balkh province. And there's a big, fat, drunken, rich warlord there called Abdul Rashid Dostum. And he has this big castle, like a big fort, crenellated walls and all, just outside of Mazar-i-Sharif. And the prisoners had been brought on the trucks to this fort, and they had been told that they weren't being taken prisoner, they were just being taken there before they were going to be allowed to go home. When they arrived, they noticed that there was a CIA guy wearing traditional Afghan clothing and strutting around speaking the local languages, Uzbek and Dari, and giving instructions to the Northern Alliance guys. And all these Taliban guys have gone, hang on a second, we are being taken prisoner. And they hadn't been disarmed. They hadn't been searched or disarmed. So up go the Shalwar Kameez, and out come grenade launchers and AK-47s, and they started to take over this fort. And they killed a lot of people, including this guy called Johnny Spann, the CIA guy. And they took over the fort. And in the basement, in the underground of the fort, was Dostum's arms cache. And they could have stayed there for years, not run out of bullets, you know. And so there were hundreds of them. And so, so this is where I was spending my time. And then you talk to people, and of course, Afghans are incredibly garrulous. So you know everything that's going on at every minute of every day, and everybody talks to you. And here you are in a battlefield, and the Taliban are leaving. So what was it like under the? You know, everything was a story. And one morning, I was sleeping in this little hotel. And it had full-length windows that looked in the direction of Dostum's fort, which was about 15 kilometres down the road. And this really old Russian-style military cot, it sprung, you know, and you could, every time you moved on it, you felt like you were going to roll off. So I'd put the mattress on the floor, and I was sleeping on the floor. And I was woken up very early one morning, just after dawn. It was October, so I guess dawn would have been around 6. And I sat bolt upright, and in time to see outside of the windows this huge mushroom cloud rising over Dostum's fort. It's the most astounding sight. I'm like, well, it can't, surely no, you know, tactical nukes, no. It was an ICBM that had been fired from a US warship in the Gulf into the middle of the fort.
To kill the Taliban people that had taken it in?
To end this siege. There was no other way they were going to end this siege than by destroying everybody who was holding the
so it was a cruise missile from an American ship targeting the fort.
Yeah. Yes. And so to answer your question, everything that I saw, everywhere that I went, and every person that I spoke to provided me with news. It was raw, it was immediate, it was fascinating, and it was valuable. And so and everything about the experience just fueled adrenaline. And so I became an adrenaline junkie, I guess, but I just found this form of reporting incredibly attractive. I mean, it's what I had grown up on. You know, you go out, do a story, come back, type it up. But this was just, this was world.
Another league.
It was world beating, yeah. And so that's what attracted me to keep going and keep doing it, because a lot of people think that they want to do it, but not everyone can do it. And by the time I got to Iraq, there are a lot of young reporters who turned up wanting to be stars because they'd seen careers made in Afghanistan, and a lot of them shouldn't have been there. They were putting themselves in danger. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't have personalities that were suited to it. And this is just a reality. You know, you have to work out for yourself, I guess, whether this is something you want to do, or do you want to do fashion reporting, or do you want to do commodities, or whatever, you know. It's all journalism. It's just different sorts. But I found that I really liked it. I thrived on it, and I was good at it.
And I want to take you now, I guess, 20 years on from there, where you did that for the last 20 years, and you were one of the last people out of Afghanistan in that dreadful cycle where the Taliban took back over Afghanistan again. And then a month or so ago, with the Taliban in control, you went back to report. We're running a little bit out of time, but encapsulate for us what happened there when you went back just to report on the new Afghanistan with the Taliban in control.
Well, as you said, I left on the 15th of August in 2021, just a couple of hours before the Taliban streamed into Kabul and completed their rout of the country. I'd spent the last 3 or 4 months reporting from all over the country on the fall, the domino effect of their takeover. And I was declared a high value target by the Taliban because of one particular story that I had done, but the body of work speaks for itself, on how they were going into areas where they had taken control and rounding up women and girls to be married off to their fighters as part of the spoils of war. They have a philosophy. Part of their philosophy is that once they take over, everything that you can see here belongs to us, and that includes the women. And I went into an area in the Central Highlands where they had taken over, attempted to do this, and then been pushed out after 4 days. And I went and interviewed people who had had this experience and wrote a story about it for Foreign Policy. And I was working with my close friend Masood Hosseini, who is an Afghan Pulitzer Prize winning photographer. And he describes our story as like setting off a bomb. We set off a bomb, he said. He says it all the time.
They didn't like you.
They didn't like us, and they pushed back. And so after the fall, we knew that we were, high value targets, HVT, and I didn't really think that there was a lot of very or enough cogent reporting on what was happening under the Taliban in Afghanistan over that year, and I knew that there would be a spike up in interest. And so in order to do coverage for the 1 year anniversary, I went in mid-July. And as part of the requirements, I declared my presence to the Foreign Ministry, and they refused to recognise me as a journalist. They had me arrested. I was detained by the Secret Service, intelligence agency, whatever. I was abused. They threatened to kill me. They said that if I didn't make public apologies for specific stories that I had written, that they would jail me. They forced me to make apologies on Twitter and to videotape messages saying that I'm not a journalist, I have no sources, I make everything up, and to apologise.
And you did that?
Yeah, whatever it takes, They stood up, they stood around me with a guy with an AK-47 there. Unless you do this, you're going to go to jail. Okay, so what is it that you want me to say? Sure.
Yeah.
And so I did it, and then they moved the furniture. Okay, now you've got to do it on video, and I'm in a chador, and I've got a hijab on, a headscarf on, and I said, okay, right, how do I look? Do I need lipstick on and a re-tip headscarf? And you look fine. And I said what they wanted me to say. My name is Lynne O'Donnell. I'm a journalist. I don't know anything about Afghanistan, its culture, its people, and I make up stories and I have no sources. And I haven't been coerced into making this admission. And when I got to the part about I haven't been coerced, I took my headscarf off and I tied it around my neck and I held it up like a noose and said, and I haven't been coerced into making this admission.
And they let you do that?
Yeah, but they all looked at each other, and then they looked at me and I looked at them, and then we all burst out laughing, and they said, I think you'd better do that again.
So these were you knew they were threatening you with their guns, but you knew for 20 years, you knew the culture of the people you were with. So did you understand that the nuances that they were, they burst out laughing, then said, do it again. So they knew that they were doing something.
Well, excuse me. I made light of it all the way through because it was a surreal and ridiculous situation. One of the stories they objected to was about how gay people, LGBTQ people, are being treated in Afghanistan. They shouted at me, there are no gays in Afghanistan. And then it was, why do you call us extremists? Why do you call us terrorists? You are terrorists, actually. The United States Security Council says that you're terrorists. So I'm not making this stuff up. Why don't you say this about America? You go back and read all of the stuff I've ever written, and you'll see nobody gets out of any, everybody is my target. Everybody, if they make a mistake, if they do something wrong, I write about everybody. Go back and look at it. No one's safe. They accused me of being a Secret Service agent because I had my phone. They didn't take my phone off me. So I was live texting this to Masood and a bunch of Australian diplomats based in Doha, you know,
Yeah.
at every step of the way. And so they decided this meant that I was an agent. And I'm like, you know, I'm a freelance journalist. Can you tell me, please, which agency? Because I'd like to. I could use the cash. You know, I'll send them an invoice. And then apropos of absolutely nothing, one of them would say, I like cats too. I just sort of go, that's a bit weird. Obviously, looking at my Instagram feed. And so I'd go,
Oh,
oh, really? How many cats do you have? And then he'd go, oh, better not talk about cats. You know, I got a frown here. You know, just crazy stuff. The whole thing was crazy, but never at any second did I take for granted that I was going to get out of there safe, alive, in a minute that day. The Taliban have a history of taking foreigners hostage and using them as collateral. They've currently got 2 American citizens incarcerated. They've just swapped 1 American citizen they held for more than 2 years for a drug dealer who was in prison in America. There was nothing lightweight or frivolous about the experience at all. It was just, I saw these guys for what they were, especially one of them. He was an idiot, and just played it for what I could, you know. At one stage, my editor at Foreign Policy, Keith, called me and he said, you know, I looked around and I said, I'll take this. He said, are you safe? And I said, one moment. Excuse me, Mr. Zahil, am I in any danger? No, Keith said, are you in any danger? You know, excuse me, Mr. Zahil, am I in any danger? And he looked up from his phone and he said, we've got the aircon, you've got tea. The other guy said, I took the lid off your bottle of water. What more do you want? No, you're not in any danger. I said to Keith, Mr. Zahil says I'm not in any danger. The whole thing was crazy.
It sounds very Kafkaesque and very surreal, but I have to, because we are running out of time. I want to, you did get out by the skin of your teeth by playing it very cleverly, it seems. But when you got back to London, you had to go and have something called the Whipple procedure. Tell us quickly about that.
Yeah, I found a lump on my diaphragm, which turned out to be a tumor on my pancreas. And I went to see my doctor and said, I feel a little bit kind of dyspeptic and this is a bit nutty. I don't know what this is. And I went through a series of tests and was told what it was and that it had to come out. So it was 3 weeks from diagnosis to surgery. And on the 31st of August, I went into hospital and I had what's called a Whipple's procedure, which is, I'm told and constantly reminded, one of the most serious surgical procedures that you can go through. I basically have had my entire digestive system re-engineered, and I had part of my pancreas removed and a whole lot of other things as well, and bits moved around and sewn to other bits. And today it's 7 weeks since my surgery. I'm up and about. I'm functioning. I can look after myself, but it's a long and rocky road. And to be honest with you, Humphrey, this is the worst thing and the most difficult thing that has ever happened to me.
And it sort of puts life in a perspective. An impossible question, because we've gone from from walking into the Melbourne Herald as a cadet, from traveling China as commodities, for working for the Chinese Communist Party in the China Daily, the war corresponding thing. And this is great. The show's called Purpose, Passion, Grit. The purpose and the passion we saw in your reporting. This is the grit that you get. Just give us a thought about all of that.
Well, I'm still coming to terms with it. It happened to me so suddenly. You know, I had this amazing, active, dynamic, hands-on hips life, you know, and I don't think it's so much a case of being humbled, but certainly being slowed down. And I'm, you know, as I come to terms with what's happened to me and what I'm going through now, I also have to come to terms with leading a slower life, at least in the short term. And I am also starting to wonder about what it is that makes something, what makes a tumor grow inside you. What is it? Everything that I've done and held on to. I've never done PTSD deprogramming. I've never talked to a psychotherapist about anything that I've been through. Have I held it all in? I've always thought there's other people who need that sort of thing. There's other people who are going through worse experiences than me. Have I just been in denial? You know, I still have a long way to go before I come to terms with this. And at the moment, what I'm dealing with is the physicality of it. Getting used to a different way of moving, a different way of eating, a different way of being, of lowered energy levels, of afternoon naps, of you know, I've never ever had to ask anybody for help before in my life. And I realized the day before I came out of hospital that I wasn't going to be able to do this by myself. And my friends have been astounding. I have neighbors who for 3 weeks, I had to ask them to stop, brought me a cooked breakfast, scrambled eggs on toast with smoked salmon every morning after I came out of hospital. That's just overwhelmed. I think they have angels living in their attic. You know, I've just been overwhelmed by the kindness and consideration of and the love of the people that I know. And I guess this had to happen to me for me to realize that it's there, and it's been wonderful.
That's Sue Townley says, Lynne, you are amazing. Thank you for sharing all of this with us. And Judy says, the most incredible woman I have ever listened to. Thank you. Now stay with us. Don't go anywhere, because we are going to tell our audience what is coming up next. And Thursday, October 20th, is that this week? We are now the 18th. In 2 days' time, Lucinda is with the great Nicholas Solomon, Chief Executive of our trade union, the Society of Authors, asking about authors' lives, the struggles, how it all works between agents, authors, publishers. That's with Lucinda on Thursday. On Friday, Lucinda talks to Alison Hill, author of Pauline Gower, pioneering leader of the Spitfire Women. Now, I didn't know this. Amazing women who led the 164 Spitfire Women's Squadron during World War II, and of course, left a huge legacy for women in aviation. October the 27th, I'm with Jen Nash, who is a communicator, and she has a book called The Big Power of Tiny Connections, How Small Interactions Spark Awesome Outcomes. Awesome's an American word, so she's across the pond, as we know. How much can a good relationship actually better your lives? And then October the 28th, Lucinda and I are in a community book club session. That's Lucinda, myself. I'm going to be discussing my Reykjavik thriller series, and Lucinda, and I've got it here, is going to be discussing her latest book, Dickens and Travel. Lynne, the Spitfire Women's Squadron, did you know about that?
Did I know that there were women who flew Spitfires?
Yes.
No, of course not.
What do you mean, of course? I didn't know, but why of course not?
Well, because, you know, we're only just entering an era, aren't we, where we're catching up on women's contribution to, I don't know, human history. So nice that we're learning about them. We should have known about them at the time, but of course, yes, there was a women's Spitfire squadron, and of course we didn't know about it until now.
Oh, no, but hold on, but that reminds me, and is that you're writing a book at the moment about women war correspondents, aren't you?
Yes, from 1899.
Yes, so what is the contribution of female war correspondents to war and corresponding?
Oh, well, we've always been covering war in very small numbers, of course, but the people that I'm writing about go back to 1899. You must have known in your time in China of Claire Hollingworth, who broke the news story of the start of World War II. She had some contemporaries, but they were basically kept out of, you know, there were US generals, British generals who didn't want women anywhere near them, almost like they were going to be bad luck. So, you know, it's time to give credit where credit is due.
And do you and your female colleagues put a different perspective on the covering of war that, say, your male counterparts do?
Well, I think so. I would say that, wouldn't I? But you know, when you go, but when you go into countries like Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq, women are traditionally not. Well, in Afghanistan, they're not allowed really culturally to speak to men who are not members of their family, but they can speak to women. And so effectively, I can say I have 100% of the population available to me. Whereas the men correspondents and you know, your colleagues in Kabul found it difficult to access women because women couldn't come to the bureau to talk to them and they couldn't go to their homes to talk to them. But I can talk to everybody, and it does give a completely different perspective to war, because the people who are most severely impacted by anything, by natural disaster, by war, by poverty, by hunger, are the women, and the women and the children. And so being able to tell the story of beyond the code on the bombs and, you know, the guns and ammo and the blasts and bombs side of war, you get the human side. And I think that's what women add to the story.
That's how we're going to finish on that thought, because it's a great summing up and a great thought. Thank you very much. Our time, unfortunately, is up. You have been a great sport in dealing with all the questions and the issues that have come up. Our audience think you are incredible and amazing. Thank you for those thoughts. Until Thursday, with Lucinda and Nicola Solomon of the Society of Authors, stay reading, stay active, stay curious, stay safe. And Jean Joyce says, amazing lady has just come in. And of course, stay Goldster. Thank you so much, Lynne O'Donnell.
Thank
and
you.
Hope to see you again. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.